Hello, Life Groups. Welcome back. We're so glad you're gathering today. We are continuing in our series called Running on Empty. And this past weekend, Pastor Brant talked about the heavy topic of depression. And we look at the world and what people are going through, and it's easy to understand why more people are depressed now more than ever. And that includes Christians. Right? Just because you call yourself a Christian and you follow Jesus doesn't mean that you're exempt from depression. And to be clear, struggling with depression doesn't mean that you're lazy. It doesn't mean that you're weak, and it certainly doesn't mean that you don't have faith. In fact, when we look at Scripture, there are some of the least lazy, some of the strongest, and some of the most faithful people struggled with severe bouts of depression. We looked at the story of Job. Job was blameless and upright, and he followed God without any outstanding weaknesses or sin, and yet God allowed Satan to afflict Job. And with the exception of his wife, Job lost everything. He lost his property, his wealth, and even his kids. And even later in the story, Satan afflicts Job's health. And his wife in this story tells Job to curse God and die. And then he has these friends that are initially there to help them, but then they kind of change their tone and they tell him that he's in the wrong. They blame him for what's happening. And through this process and in Scripture, we see Job being depressed, and Job is lonely. And then we jump over to the book of Psalms, where we see David, who Scripture tells us is a man after God's own heart, but yet he struggled with depression. A lot of the Psalms were written by David, and there are even full chapters written by this king who was a man after God's own heart, but was also depressed. In fact, one third of the Psalms are actually laments. And he talks about just trying to hang on, or that enemies are chasing him down. David is certainly depressed. He's desperate and at times feeling hopeless. And then from David, we fast forward almost 100 years and we meet Elijah. And at the point of the story that we talked about this past weekend, Elijah has just defeated the prophets of Baal. And you can read about that story in 1 Kings 18. But it's a literal and figurative mountaintop experience. And then later in the story, Elijah is sent a death threat by Queen Jezebel. And instead of being confident in God, Elijah runs for his life. This guy who has seen God do some amazing and unbelievable things, and God had already saved his life, but when threatened by the queen, he was ready to give up. He was ready to tap out. He even tells the Lord, hey, go ahead and take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors. The beautiful thing about Scripture is that in a lot of ways it mirrors our own lives, and we can take comfort in the fact and be confident in the fact that even these spiritual giants that we read about in Scripture dealt with depression. And maybe you can relate. Maybe you or someone you know is dealing with or has dealt with depression. And I think one of the important things for us to remember and to understand is that we're never alone. And that there are ways to battle depression, right? And whether that be through worship and prayer and Bible study and community, or whether that be through medicine, or maybe through therapy and counseling, there are resources available for those who are battling and struggling with depression. Or maybe you just need to hear that God cares about you. Maybe you need to hear that God has a grand and great plan for you, or maybe you're someone who needs to carry that message to someone else, right? I think if we're honest with ourselves and honest with each other, we all struggle with something. And our responsibility is to continue to love and show grace and help each other along the way. Enjoy your discussion today.